Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 24, during which Mr. Fogg and party cross the Pacific Ocean. What happened when the pilot boat came in sight of Shanghai will be easily guessed. The signals made by the tanker had been seen by the captain of the Yokohama steamer, who, espying the flag at half-mast, had directed his course towards the little craft. Phileas Fogg, after paying the stipulated price of his passage to John Busby, and rewarding that worthy with the additional sum of £550, ascended the steamer with Aouda and Fix, and they started at once for Nagasaki and Yokohama. They reached their destination on the morning of the 14th of November. Phileas Fogg lost no time in going on board the Carnatic, where he learned, to Aouda's great delight, and perhaps to his own, though he betrayed no emotion, that Passepartout, a Frenchman, had really arrived on her the day before. The San Francisco steamer was announced to leave that very evening, and it became necessary to find Passepartout, if possible, without delay. Mr. Fogg applied in vain to the French and English consuls, and after wandering through the streets a long time, began to despair of finding his missing servant. Chance, or perhaps a kind of presentiment, at last led him into the Honourable Mr. Battlecar's theatre. He certainly would not have recognized Passepartout in the eccentric mountebank's costume, but the latter, lying on his back, perceived his master in the gallery. He could not help starting, which so changed the position of his nose as to bring the pyramid pell-mell upon the stage. All this Passepartout learned from Aouda, who recounted to him what had taken place on the voyage from Hong Kong to Shanghai on the tanker, in company with one Mr. Fix. Passepartout did not change countenance on hearing this name. He thought that the time had not yet arrived to divulge to his master what had taken place between the detective and himself, and in the account he gave of his absence he simply excused himself for having been overtaken by drunkenness in smoking opium at a tavern in Hong Kong. Mr. Fogg heard this narrative coldly, without a word, and then furnished his man with necessary funds to obtain clothing more in harmony with his position. Within an hour the Frenchman had cut off his nose and parted with his wings, and retained nothing about him which recalled the secretary of the god Tingle. The steamer, which was about to depart from Yokohama to San Francisco, belonged to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and was named the General Grant. She was a large paddle-wheel steamer of 2,500 tons, well-equipped and very fast. The massive walking beam rose and fell above the deck. At one end a piston rod worked up and down, and at the other was a connecting rod, which, in changing the rectilinear motion to a circular one, was directly connected with the shaft of the paddles. The General Grant was rigged with 3 masts, giving a large capacity for sails, and thus materially aiding the steam power. By making 12 miles an hour she would cross the ocean in 21 days. Phileas Fogg was therefore justified in hoping that he would reach San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London on the 20th, thus gaining several hours on the fatal date of the 21st of December. There was a full complement of passengers on board. Mr. Fogg was as calm and taciturn as ever, and his young companion felt herself more and more attracted to him by other ties than gratitude. His silent but generous nature impressed her more than she thought, and it was almost unconsciously that she yielded to emotions which did not seem to have the least effect on her protector. Aouda took the keenest interest in his plans, and became impatient at any instant which seemed likely to retard his journey. She often chatted with Passepartout, who did not fail to perceive the state of the lady's heart, and, being the most faithful of domestics, he never exhausted his eulogies of Phileas Fogg's honesty, generosity, and devotion. He took pains to calm Aouda's doubts of a successful termination of the journey, telling her that the most difficult part of it had passed, that now they were beyond the fantastic countries of Japan and China, and were fairly on their way to civilized places again. A railway train from San Francisco to New York, and a transatlantic steamer from New York to London, would doubtless bring them to the end of this impossible journey round the world within the period agreed upon. On the 9th day after leaving Yokohama, Phileas Fogg had traversed exactly 1/2 of the terrestrial globe. The General Grant passed on the 23rd of November the 180th meridian, and was at the very antipodes of London. Mr. Fogg had exhausted 52 of the 80 days, and there were 28 left. but though he was only halfway by the difference of meridians, he had really gone over 2/3 of the whole journey, for he had been obliged to make long circuits from London to Aden, from Aden to Bombay, from Calcutta to Singapore, and from Singapore to Yokohama. Could he have followed without deviation the 50th parallel, which is that of London, the whole distance would have only taken 12,000 miles, whereas he would be forced by the irregular methods of locomotion to traverse 26,000, of which he had, on the 23rd of November, accomplished 17,500. And now the course was a straight one, and Fix was no longer there to put obstacles in their way. It may also be remembered that obstinate fellow Passepartout had insisted on keeping his watch at London time, and on regarding the countries that they passed through as quite false and unreliable. Now, on this day, though he had not changed the hands, he found that his watch exactly agreed with the ship's chronometers. His triumph was hilarious. He would have liked to know what Fix would say if he were aboard. "That rogue told me a lot of stories about the meridians, and the sun and the moon." "The moon, indeed! Moonshine, more likely. If one listened to that sort of people, a pretty sort of time one would keep. I was sure that the sun would some day regulate itself by my watch." Passepartout was ignorant that, if the face of his watch had been divided into 24 hours, like the Italian clocks, he would have no reason for exultation. For the hands of his watch would then, instead of, as now, indicating 9 o'clock in the morning, indicate 9 o'clock in the evening, that is, the 21st hour after midnight precisely, the difference between London time and that of the 180th meridian. But if Fix had been able to explain this purely physical effect, Passepartout would not have admitted, even if he had comprehended it. Moreover, if the detective had been on board at that moment, Passepartout would have joined issue with him on a quite different subject, and an entirely different matter. Where was Fix at that moment? He was actually on board the General Grant. On reaching Yokohama, the detective, leaving Mr. Fogg, whom he expected to meet again during the day, had repaired at once to the English consulate, where he had at last found the warrant of arrest. It had followed him from Bombay, and had come by the Carnatic, on which steamer he himself was supposed to be. Fix's disappointment may be imagined when he reflected that the warrant was now useless. Mr. Fogg had left English ground, and it was now necessary to procure his extradition. "Well, my warrant is not good here, but it will be in England, for the rogue evidently intends to return to his own country, thinking he has thrown the police off his track. Good! I will follow him across the Atlantic. As for the money, heaven grant there may be some left, but the fellow has already spent in travelling, rewards, trials, bail, elephants, and all sorts of charges, more than 5,000 of the pounds. Yet, after all, the bank is rich." His course decided on, he went on board the General Grant, and was there when Mr. Fogg and Aouda arrived. To his utter amazement he recognized Passepartout, despite his theatrical disguise. He quickly concealed himself in his cabin, to avoid an awkward explanation, and hoped, thanks to the number of passengers, to remain unperceived by Mr. Fogg's servant. On that day, however, he met Passepartout face to face on the forward deck. The latter, without a word, made a rush for him, grasped him by the throat, and, much to the amusement of a group of Americans, who immediately began to bet on him, administered to the detective a perfect volley of blows, which proved the great superiority of French over English pugilistic skill. When Passepartout had finished, he found himself relieved and comforted. Fix got up in a somewhat rumpled condition, and looking at his adversary, said, "Have you done?" "For the time, yes." "Then let me have a word with you." "But it's in your master's interests." Passepartout seemed to be vanquished by Fix's coolness, for he quietly followed him, and they sat down apart from the rest of the passengers. "You have given me a thrashing. Good. I expected it. But now you listen to me. Up to this time I have been Mr. Fogg's adversary. I am now in his game." "Huh? You are now convinced he is an honest man?" "No. I think him a rascal. Don't budge, let me speak. As long as Mr. Fogg was on English ground, it was in my interest to detain him there until my warrant of arrest arrived. I did everything I could to keep him back. I sent for Bombay priests after him. I got you intoxicated at Hong Kong. I separated you from him, and I made you miss the Yokohama steamer. Passepartout listened with closed fists. Now Mr. Fogg seems to be going back to England. Well, I will follow him there, and hereafter I will do as much to keep obstacles out of his way as I have done up to this time to keep them in his path. I've changed my game, you see, and simply because it was my interest to change it. Your interest is now the same as mine, for it is only in England that you will ascertain whether you are in the service of a criminal or an honest man. Passepartout listened very attentively to Fix, and was convinced that he spoke with entire good faith. Are we friends? Friends? No. But allies, perhaps. At the least sign of treason, however, I will twist your neck for you. Agreed. 11 days later, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant entered the Bay of the Golden Gate and reached San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor lost a single day. End of chapter 24. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 25, in which a slight glimpse is had of San Francisco. It was 7 in the morning when Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout set foot upon the American continent, if this name can be given to the floating quay upon which they disembarked. These quays, rising and falling with the tide, thus facilitate the loading and unloading of vessels. Alongside them were clippers of all sizes, steamers of all nationalities, and the steamboats with several decks rising one above the other, which ply on the Sacramento and its tributaries. There were also heaped up the products of a commerce which extends to Mexico, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Europe, Asia, and all the Pacific Islands. Passepartout, in his joy on reaching at last the American continent, thought he would manifest it by executing a perilous vault in fine style, but, tumbling upon some worm-eaten planks, he fell through them. Put out of countenance by the manner in which he thus set foot upon the New World, he uttered a loud cry which so frightened the innumerable cormorants and pelicans that are always perched upon these movable quays, that they flew noisily away. Mr. Fogg, on reaching shore, proceeded to find out at what hour the first train left for New York, and learned that this was at 6 o'clock p.m. He had, therefore, an entire day to spend in the Californian capital. Taking a carriage at a charge of $3, he and Aouda entered it, while Passepartout mounted the box beside the driver, and they set out for the International Hotel. From his exalted position, Passepartout observed with much curiosity the wide streets, the low, evenly ranged houses, the Anglo-Saxon Gothic churches, the great docks, the palatial wooden and brick warehouses, the numerous conveyances, omnibuses, horse-cars, and upon the sidewalks not only Americans and Europeans, but Chinese and Indians. Passepartout was surprised at all he saw. San Francisco was no longer the legendary city of 1849, a city of banditti, assassins, and incendiaries, who had flocked hither in crowds in pursuit of plunder, a paradise of outlaws, where they gambled with gold dust, a revolver in one hand and a bowie knife in the other. It was now a great commercial emporium. The lofty tower of its city hall overlooked the whole panorama of the streets and avenues, which cut each other at right angles, and in the midst of which appeared pleasant, verdant squares, while beyond appeared the Chinese quarter, seemingly imported from the Celestial Empire in a toy-box. Sombreros and red shirts and plumed Indians were rarely to be seen, but there were silk hats and black coats everywhere, worn by a multitude of nervously active, gentlemanly-looking men. Some of the streets, especially Montgomery Street, which is to San Francisco what Regent Street is to London, the Boulevard des Italiens to Paris, the Broadway to New York, were lined with splendid and spacious stores, which exposed in their windows the products of the entire world. After breakfast, Mr. Fogg, accompanied by Aouda, started for the English consulate to have his passport visaed. As he was going out, he met Passepartout, who asked him if it would not be well, before taking the train, to purchase some dozens of Enfield rifles and Colt's revolvers. He had been listening to stories of attacks upon the trains by the Sioux and Pawnees. Mr. Fogg thought it a useless precaution, but told him to do as he thought best, and went on to the consulate. He had not proceeded 200 steps, however, when, by the greatest chance in the world, he met Fix. The detective seemed wholly taken by surprise. What? Had Fogg and himself crossed the Pacific together and not met on the steamer? At least Fix felt honoured to behold once more the gentleman to whom he owed so much, and as his business recalled him to Europe, he should be delighted to continue the journey in such pleasant company. Mr. Fogg replied that the honour would be his, and the detective, who was determined not to lose sight of him, begged permission to accompany them in their walk about San Francisco, a request which Mr. Fogg readily granted. They soon found themselves in Montgomery Street, where a great crowd was collected. The sidewalks, the street, house-car rails, the shop doors, the windows of the houses, and even the roofs, were full of people. Men were going about carrying large posters, and flags and streamers were floating in the wind, while loud cries were heard on every hand. "Hurrah for Camerfield! Hurrah for Manderby!" It was a political meeting, at least so Fix conjectured, who said to Mr. Fogg, "Perhaps we had better not mingle with the crowd. There may be danger in it." "Yes, and blows, even if they are political, are still blows." Fix smiled at this remark, and in order to be able to see without being jostled about, the party took up a position on the top of a flight of steps. Opposite them, on the other side of the street, between a coal wharf and a petroleum warehouse, a large platform had been erected in the open air, towards which the current of the crowd seemed to be directed. What was the purpose of this meeting? What was the occasion of this excited assemblage? Phileas Fogg could not imagine. Was it to nominate some high official, a governor or member of Congress? It was not improbable, so agitated was the multitude before them. Just at this moment there was an unusual stir in the human mass. All the hands were raised in the air. Some, tightly closed, seemed to disappear suddenly in the midst of the cries, an energetic way, no doubt, of casting a vote. The crowd swayed back, the banners and flags wavered, disappeared an instant, then reappeared, in tatters. The undulations of the human surge reached the steps, while all the heads floundered on the surface like a sea agitated by a squall. Many of the black hats disappeared, and the greater part of the crowd seemed to have diminished in height. "It's evidently a meeting, and its object must be an exciting one. I should wonder if it were about the Alabama, despite the fact that that question is settled." "Perhaps." Aouda, leaning upon Mr. Fogg's arm, observed the tumultuous scene with surprise, while Fix asked the man near him what the cause of it all was. A fresh agitation arose. Hurrahs and excited shouts were heard. The staffs of the banners began to be used as offensive weapons. The fists flew about in every direction. There was the crack of revolvers. The onlookers could not tell whether Manderby or Camerfield had the upper hand. "It would be prudent for us to retire." Fix was anxious that Mr. Fogg should not receive any injury, at least until they got to London. "If there is any question about England in all this, and we were recognized, I fear it would go hard with us." "An English subject," began Mr. Fogg, but he did not finish his sentence, for a terrific hubbub now arose on the terrace behind the flight of steps where they stood, and there were frantic shouts. "Hurrah
for Mandy Boy! Hip, hip! Hurrah!
It was a band of voters coming to the rescue of their allies, and taking the Camerfield forces in flank. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Fix found themselves between two fires. It was too late to escape. The torrent of men armed with loaded canes and sticks was irresistible. Phileas Fogg and Fix were roughly hustled in their attempts to protect their fair companion. The former, as cool as ever, tried to defend himself with the weapons which nature had placed at the end of every Englishman's arms, but in vain. A big, brawny fellow with a red beard, flushed face, and broad shoulders, who seemed to be the chief of the band, raised his clenched fist to strike Mr. Fogg, whom he would have given a crushing blow, had not Fix rushed in and received it in his stead. An enormous bruise immediately made its appearance under the detective's silk hat, which was completely smashed in.
"Yankee! Englishman! We will meet again! What's your name?"
"Phileas Fogg." "And yours?"
"Colonel Stamp Proctor."
The human tide now swept by, after overturning Fix, who speedily got upon his feet again, though with tattered clothes. Happily he was not seriously hurt. His travelling overcoat was divided into two unequal parts, and his trousers resembled those of certain Indians, which fit less compactly than they used to. Aouda had escaped unharmed, and Fix alone bore marks of the fray in his black and blue bruise. "Thanks," said Mr. Fogg to the detective. "No thanks are necessary. But let us go." "Where?" "To a tailor's." Such a visit was indeed opportune. The clothing of both Mr. Fogg and Fix was in rags, as if they themselves had been actively engaged in the contest between Camerfield and Mandyboys. Passepartout was waiting for his master, armed with half a dozen six-barrelled revolvers. When he perceived Fix, he knit his brows. But Aouda having in a few words told him of their adventure, his countenance resumed its placid expression. Fix evidently was no longer an enemy, but an ally. He was faithfully keeping his word. Dinner over, the coach, which was to convey the passengers and their luggage to the station, drew up at the door. "You have not seen this Colonel Proctor again, Mr. Fix?" "No." "I will come back to America to find him. It would not be right for an Englishman to permit himself to be treated in that way, without retaliating." The detective smiled, but did not reply. It was clear that Mr. Fogg was one of those Englishmen who, while they do not tolerate duelling at home, fight abroad when their honour is attacked. At 6:15 the travellers reached the station, and found the train ready to depart. As he was about to enter it, Mr. Fogg called a porter. "My friend, was there not some trouble today in San Francisco?"
"It was a political meeting, sir."
"But I thought there was a great deal of disturbance in the streets."
"It was only a meeting assembled for an election."
"The election of a general-in-chief, no doubt."
"No, sir, of a justice of the peace."
Phileas Fogg got into the train, which started off at full speed. End of chapter 25. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Chapter 26, in which Phileas Fogg and party travel by the Pacific Railroad. "From ocean to ocean," so say the Americans, and these four words compose the general designation of the Great Trunk Line, which crosses the entire width of the United States. The Pacific Railroad is, however, really divided into two distinct lines, the Central Pacific between San Francisco and Ogden, and the Union Pacific between Ogden and Omaha. 5 main lines connect Omaha with New York. New York and San Francisco are thus united by an uninterrupted metal ribbon, which measures no less than 3,786 miles. Between Omaha and the Pacific, the railroad crosses a territory which is still infested by Indians and wild beasts, and a large tract which the Mormons, after they were driven from Illinois in 1845, began to colonize. The journey from New York to San Francisco consumed, formerly under the most favourable conditions, at least 6 months. It is now accomplished in 7 days. It was in 1862 that, in spite of the Southern members of Congress, who wished a more southerly route, it was decided to lay the road between the 41st and 42nd parallels. President Lincoln himself fixed the end of the line at Omaha, in Nebraska. The work was at once commenced, and pursued with true American energy, nor did the rapidity with which it went on injuriously affect its good execution. The road grew on the prairies 1.5 miles a day. A locomotive running on the rails laid down the evening before brought the rails to be laid on the morrow, and advanced upon them as fast as they were put in position. The Pacific Railroad is joined by several branches in Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Oregon, its grade, even on the Rocky Mountains, never exceeding 112 feet to the mile. Such was the road to be traversed in 7 days, which would enable Phileas Fogg, at least so he hoped, to take the Atlantic steamer at New York on the 11th for Liverpool. The car which he occupied was a sort of long omnibus on 8 wheels, and with no compartments in the interior. It was supplied with 2 rows of seats perpendicular to the direction of the train on either side of an aisle which conducted to the front and rear platforms. These platforms were found throughout the train, and the passengers were able to pass from one end of the train to the other. It was supplied with saloon cars, balcony cars, restaurants and smoking cars. Theatre cars alone were wanting, and they will have these some day. Book and news dealers, sellers of edibles, drinkables and cigars, who seemed to have plenty of customers, were continually circulating in the aisles. The train left Oakland Station at 6 o'clock. It was already night, cold and cheerless, the heavens being overcast with clouds which seemed to threaten snow. The train did not proceed rapidly. Counting the stoppages, it did not run more than 20 miles an hour, which was a sufficient speed, however, to enable it to reach Omaha within its designated time. There was but little conversation in the car, and soon many of the passengers were overcome with sleep. Passepartout found himself beside the detective, but he did not talk to him. After recent events, their relations with each other had grown somewhat cold. There could no longer be mutual sympathy or intimacy between them. Fix's manner had not changed, but Passepartout was very reserved, and ready to strangle his former friend on the slightest provocation. Snow began to fall an hour after they started. A fine snow, however, which happily could not obstruct the train. Nothing could be seen from the windows but a vast white sheet against which the smoke of a locomotive had a greyish aspect. At 8 o'clock a steward entered the car and announced that the time for going to bed had arrived, and in a few minutes the car was transformed into a dormitory. The backs of the seats were thrown back, bedsteads carefully packed were rolled out by an ingenious system, berths were suddenly improvised, and each traveller had soon at his disposition a comfortable bed, protected from curious eyes by thick curtains. The sheets were clean and the pillows soft. It only remained to go to bed and sleep, which everybody did, while the train sped on across the state of California. The line from San Francisco to Sacramento runs in a northeasterly direction across the American River, which empties into San Pablo Bay. The 120 miles between these cities were accomplished in 6 hours, and towards midnight, while fast asleep, the travellers passed through Sacramento, so that they saw nothing of that important place, the seat of the state government, with its fine quays, its broad streets, its noble hotels, squares and churches. The train, on leaving Sacramento and passing the junction, entered the range of the Sierra Nevada.
Cisco was reached at 7 in the morning, and an hour later the dormitory was transferred into an ordinary car, and the travellers could observe the picturesque beauties of the mountain region through which they were steaming. The railway track wound in and out among the passes, now approaching the mountain sides, now suspended over precipices, avoiding abrupt angles by bold curves, plunging into narrow defiles, which seemed to have no outlet. The locomotive, its great funnel emitting a weird light, with its sharp bell and its cow-catcher extended like a spur, mingled its shrieks and bellowings with the noise of torrents and cascades, and twined its smoke among the branches of the gigantic pines. There were few or no bridges or tunnels on the route. The railway turned around the sides of the mountains, and did not attempt to violate nature by taking the shortest cut from one point to another. The train entered the state of Nevada through the Carson Valley about 9 o'clock, going always northeasterly, and at midday reached Reno, where there was a delay of 20 minutes for breakfast. From this point the road, running along Humboldt River, passed northward for several miles by its banks, then it turned eastwards, and kept by the river until it reached the Humboldt Range, nearly at the extreme eastern limit of Nevada. Having breakfasted, Mr. Fogg and his companions resumed their places in the car, and observed the varied landscape which unfolded itself as they passed along the vast prairies, the mountains lining the horizon, and the creeks with their frothy, foaming streams. Sometimes a great herd of buffaloes, massing together in the distance, seemed like a movable dam. These innumerable multitudes of ruminating beasts often form an insurmountable object of a passage of the trains. Thousands of them have been seen passing over the track for hours together in compact ranks. The locomotive is then forced to stop and wait till the road is once more clear. This happened indeed to the train in which Mr. Fogg was travelling. About 12 o'clock a troop of 10 or 12,000 head of buffalo encumbered the track. The locomotive, slackening its speed, tried to clear the way with its cow-catcher, but the mass of animals was too great. The buffaloes marched along with a tranquil gait, uttering now and then deafening bellowings. There was no use of interrupting them, for, having taken a particular direction, nothing can moderate and change their course. It is a torrent of living flesh which no dam could contain. The travellers gazed on this curious spectacle from the platforms, but Phileas Fogg, who had the most reason of all to be in a hurry, remained in his seat and waited philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to get out of the way. Passepartout was furious at the delay that they occasioned, and longed to discharge his arsenal of revolvers upon them. "What a country! Mere cattle stop the trains, and go by in a procession, just as if they were not impeding travel. Pablo, I should like to know if Mr. Fogg foresaw this mishap in his programme. And here's an engineer who doesn't dare to run the locomotive into his herd of beasts." The engineer did not try to overcome the obstacle, and he was wise. He would have crushed the first buffaloes, no doubt, with the cow-catcher, but the locomotive, however powerful, would soon have been checked. The train would inevitably have been thrown off the track, and would then have been helpless. The best course was to wait patiently, and regain the lost time by greater speed when the obstacle was removed. The procession of buffaloes lasted 3 full hours, and it was night before the track was clear. The last ranks of the herd were now passing over the rails, while the first had already disappeared below the southern horizon. It was 8 o'clock when the train passed through the defiles of the Humboldt Range, and 9:30 when it penetrated Utah, the region of the Great Salt Lake, the singular colony of the Mormons. End of chapter 26.